vegetables from countries that use pesticides that are disallowed here. We have an unsafe food supply, we have more people out of work, and we have deficits because we don't have tax-paying citizens. This bill simply is a common-sense bipartisan solution that puts people back to work, provides a safe food supply, and makes America more sound. It's common sense. We should vote for it. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from California.
I'm sorry. I lost track of this one. I'd like to yield 2.5 minutes to Mr. Thompson from California.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong opposition to this Jobs Killer Act that ignores more than 20 years of established science. Tens of thousands of people depend on the Bay Delta for their livelihoods, including many farmers, fishermen, and sportsmen who contribute billions of dollars to our economy every year. Sadly, the sponsors of this bill are using the legislation to create winners and losers by preempting California state law. This bill would take water from folks in Northern California for use in California's Central Valley. This means even less water to sports fishermen and to commercial fishermen, the basis of two thriving industries in our state. The Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Association strongly opposes the bill. They estimate that over 25,000 jobs were lost in the salmon fishing industry due to the 2008 and 2009 closures. The American Sports Fishing Association shows that California's economy suffered $1.4 billion in loss each year that the salmon fishery season is closed. If this bill becomes law, these jobs would be lost forever and the economic losses would be permanent. Appropriate amounts of water are also critical to support the economies for wildlife-associated recreation. In California, 7.4 million sportsmen contribute over $8 billion to the economy every year. Without water, many of these hunting, fishing, and wildlife watching activities will be lost. More than 200 sportsmen's organizations have written to express their opposition to this bill. These men and women recognize the extreme consequences of this measure. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to insert this letter that I have signed by those over 200 organizations into the record.
The gentleman's request is covered by general leave. You may proceed.
That's 200. That's more than the 12 or 14 members of the state legislature that wrote you a letter. In the end, H.R. 1837 is nothing more than an attempt by well-funded water contractors to steal water from other users with no regard for the fishers, sportsmen, the farmers north of the Delta, the families and the businesses who depend on their Delta for their livelihood. It guts environmental protections and kills local jobs. It should be rejected, and solutions to California's water challenges should be based on strong and sound science, and it should be done with all of the stakeholders at the table, not in the proverbial back room. So please join me and over 100 outdoor and fishing organizations and the Western States Water Council to protect Northern California.
The gentleman from Washington.
Ask for 30 more seconds.
15 more seconds.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 15 seconds.
Thank you. The Western States Water Council to protect Northern Californians from political agendas that harm our economy, wildlife, and the people. Vote no on this bill.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Washington.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, before I yield 1 minute to the gentleman for California, here are a number of organizations that have written in support of this legislation on both sides of these pages, and at the appropriate time, I too will insert them in the record to show that there is broad support for this legislation. And I now please yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding. I must say, for those of us that have seen this with our own eyes, that saw the devastation in the Central Valley, we know for a fact that when the aqueduct pumps in California were slowed, when that water came to a halt because of the orders and opinions issued partly by the Obama administration, what we saw was devastation. And we saw the worst of it in 2010. Over 1 million acre-feet of water were lost. Tens of thousands of jobs were destroyed in our state.
The unemployment rate, my friends, in some of these Central Valley towns reached 40%. And those signs that I saw along the I-5 when I was going up to take a look at this, they told a certain story, and these were written by farmers. No water equals no jobs. You'd go down the highway, food grows where water flows, but there was no food growing. The devastation was incredible. My personal favorite, new dust bowl created by Congress.
30 seconds.
New dust bowl created by Congress. Well, this legislation would bring some sanity back to this process. By restoring water deliveries to the levels agreed upon in the 1994 Bay Delta Accords between California and the federal government, this bill could bring back 30,000 jobs, and it would save millions of acre-feet of water, which has been sent to the ocean. Listen, my friends, this is a man-made problem. It's going to take legislation to fix. This bill will fix it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, I too also toured the area, and the devastation was very severe. And I wish that some of the areas find another way to be able to find employment, because this is a chronic unemployment circle, if you will, for years, for decades. It isn't just new. I yield 1.5 minutes to Mr. Grijalva from the gentleman from Arizona.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong opposition to H.R. 1837, the San Joaquin Valley Water Reliability Act. This legislation repeals existing state law and frankly leaves no state safe. If enacted, 1837 would set an unprecedented standard of state preemption. As a member of the Subcommittee on Water and Power, I am concerned that the opposition to this legislation, over 300 stakeholders, over 7 states, the nonpartisan Western States Water Council, various attorney generals from New Mexico to other states have voiced their concern about the preemption and the concern about the intrusion into what has traditionally been a state's right in terms of water management. If enacted, this unprecedented standard of state preemption would be a precedent that brings many states' water settlements into question. In my state, Arizona, where a diverse set of stakeholders, water users, Indian tribes, municipalities, the federal government, were involved in lengthy years in reaching water agreements to try to balance the use of water in our state. They were crafted, they were difficult, they were delicate, but agreement happened, and now those are now being implemented throughout the state. Raises questions about that difficult process, particularly when you had tribal governments involved in these negotiations and are part of the settlement. Issues of sovereignty and states' rights are preeminent in this question. I urge a vote no. Thank you.
Arizona has expired. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I am very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished Majority Whip, another gentleman for California who has seen the effects of what this man-made drought has. 3 minutes to Mr. McCarthy.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank Chairman Hastings for his work in committee, and I'd also like to thank Mr. Speaker, the subcommittee chairman, Tom McClintock, and the author of this bill, Devin Nunes and Jeff Denham, for their work. Now, in California, there's a saying, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. And for too long, we've been fighting about water. You know, for too long, this man-made drought in California has been ignored. Well, you know, today that stops. I'm excited about it stopping today, because you're going to hear a lot of arguments on both sides, but that's where we're supposed to debate, on the floor of the House. But you know the thing we've always yearned for, the thing we've always taught our children? That agreement is an agreement. That you keep your bond. You come into a debate where you make your points, but when you come to an agreement, you keep it. Simply put, what does this bill do? This bill simply says an agreement is an agreement. When both sides sat down from the Bay Area Delta Accord, why was it named that? Because people from the Bay Area and people from the Delta had discussions, had fights, had policy arguments, and they finally came to agreement. Now, who was on what side? Was it all just based upon a farmer or just based upon environmentalists? No. There was the Clinton administration. There was the Pete Wilson in the state. He was governor at the time. There were farmers. There was environmentalists. Mr. Speaker, there were people that was in the administration, or even members of this chambers today, spoke in support of this. So if you made an agreement then, why do you want to break it? And because what the man-made drought has done, have you ever examined the pain that it has caused? I know people, when they think of California, sure, you think of Silicon Valley, you think of Hollywood, you think of San Diego. Well, you know what? There's this whole area in the valley. And when you start and talk about the area of the valley, you know where my district is? My district is from the Grapes of Wrath. It's the shantytown everybody ended up in. Cesar Chavez is buried in my district. But you know what I saw from my valley on up? 30, 40% unemployment. I saw people standing in line. I'm very proud of the district I'm fortunate to represent. There's 2 families in my district that grow 80% of all the carrots in the country. But you know, because of this man-made drought, where hundreds of people were lined up to get food at the food bank, they were getting carrots. But were they getting carrots from America? No, they were getting carrots from China. From China. The breadbasket of America. Well, you know, that all ends today. And it ends with a bipartisan agreement that America craves for us to find. You know what? In the Bay Delta Accord, I didn't get everything that I would represent philosophically. The other side didn't as well. But you know, the greatest thing about America is the rule of law. If we make an agreement, we should stick to the agreement. And simply put, that's what this bill does, and ends the man-made drought.
Time of the gentleman's expired. The gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would love to yield 2.5 minutes from the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardoza.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
May I ask what time we have, sir, left?
Gentlelady from California has 8 minutes remaining, and the gentleman from Washington has 3 3/4 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Mr. Cardoza.
Gentleman from California.
I thank my colleague for yielding. I rise today to offer my support for the legislation, Mr. Speaker. This bill, like so many others we vote on, is far from perfect. However, I'll support this bill because of many provisions, important provisions for my valley within it. Mr. Chairman, water is absolutely critical to the economy of the San Joaquin Valley, the valley I love. Without an adequate water supply, agricultural fields go fallow and entire communities can be laid to waste. No one understands this more than myself and my colleague, Mr. Costa, my friend from the valley. We have both fought for water for our entire careers for our people. In fact, just last year, he and I introduced legislation to provide operational flexibility in the implementation of the Endangered Species Act for water deliveries for the Central Valley Project. Unfortunately, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle haven't felt the importance of holding a hearing on that bill. Titles 1 and 3 of this legislation aim to address the flawed regulations that have reduced our vital water deliveries to my friends and neighbors throughout the valley. I have no reservations in supporting these provisions and recommend to my colleagues a yes vote and on these provisions, and on the other side, I commend them for introducing these provisions. When it comes to Title II of this bill, which calls for the repeal and replaces the San Joaquin River Restoration Act, I would like to mention that this was a locally requested and locally championed piece of legislation to end an 18-year lawsuit. And although I had serious reservations when this bill was first introduced, I supported the solution when it was came through this House, and I will say now that the implementation of this act, as it's been done by the administration, has left a lot to be desired. I have significant further reservations with the San Joaquin Restoration Program, and it has recently become clear that those views that I expressed during its formation are coming to pass. The restoration is far too costly, and its schedule is advancing in a way that landowners adjacent to the new flows are being damaged. Despite this, just simply saying to remove the agreement that has been put in place is not the answer. We don't need to repeal it, we need to repair it. particularly when the only thing that repeal accomplishes is a continuation of the lawsuit that prompted the legislation in the first place.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I'll reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. The gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Northern California, Mr. Miller.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. I rise in strong opposition to this legislation. Let us understand what's taking place here. In California, for the first time in 40 years, all of the various water parties have gotten together to try to work out these disagreements and to come up with a sustainable water policy that serves all of the needs of all Californians. Agriculture, manufacturing, municipal uses, the environmental uses, all of that together. It's blessed by the state legislature for the first time passed a historic legislation empowering these negotiations to take place, to take care of the disparate interests. But there's a couple of parties in that negotiation that keep threatening to walk out of the room. They're going to walk out, walk out, walk out. Well, apparently they did walk out. They walked out and they came back to Washington, D.C. to cut a separate deal. These are among the largest water users in the state. These are among the most heavily subsidized users in the state. One of our conservative friends on the other side was complaining about the deficit when he started to talk on this bill. These are people who are getting a $400 million interest-free loan from the taxpayers of this country. These are the people that get $400 million in subsidies every year from the taxpayers of these countries. And what did they do? In this bill, they have an earmark. You gave them 40 years and these rights in perpetuity to get at least $400 million a year from the taxpayers of this country. That's not on top of the crop subsidies. That's not on top of the insurance payments, disaster payments. This is just in subsidized water that goes to these people who are crying poor. And the largest users have decided they want two negotiations, one in California and one in Washington. And to do that, they want to overturn the California laws, the California legislature, the Supreme Court decisions, and the science. We'll go back in time 18 years and say this science is good enough. But the heart of this, more than water, is money. And the money sits there and it flows with the water. Every drop of water that goes to the San Luis unit and others is subsidized. And right now, they only have a year-to-year contract. They have a 20-year contract possibly if they reach agreement. You give them 40 years and then 40 years in perpetuity. $400 billion a year, $400 million a year times perpetuity. You figure out what this earmark's worth. You figure out what this special treatment's worth. You want to know who's driving this process? It's those very, very special interests that are moving this process. And apparently they can move our friends on the other side to overturn Supreme Court opinions. They can overturn the state legislature. They can overturn these negotiations. You know, there used to be a saying around here that says it takes some skill and talent to build a barn, but any damn fool can kick it down. So what these people decide is they're just going to kick over those negotiations in California, those negotiations that people invested a huge amount of time, talent, from the legislature to the agencies, to the farmers, to the environmentalists, to our cities, our counties. All of them oppose this legislation.
Time of the gentleman's expired. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chair, before I yield 45 seconds to the author of this legislation, I just want to point out this bill came out of committee with bipartisan support, and we've had bipartisan debate for this bill. I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from California.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 30 seconds.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would just say that the gentleman from California, I would hope that he read the bill because he complains about the subsidies. But in fact, this bill gets rid of the subsidies. This bill returns almost $300 billion, $300 million to the Treasury. So we agree. We want to get rid of the subsidies. We want to cut the deficit. That's what this bill does. And so I didn't quite understand what he was talking about tearing down farms, but I would say that the gentleman's legislation that was passed with a senator from New Jersey and a congressman from California to preempt state law has been very successful at tearing apart farms and families. And if I could get 15 more seconds, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman, 15 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
Once again, as many of my colleagues would say, Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt made a deal with Republican Governor Pete Wilson A deal is a deal. The only problem is that there were some dishonest brokers at the table that never went to Congress to get this implemented.
Gentlelady from California.
May I inquire the Speaker how much time is left?
Gentlelady from California has 2.5 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Washington has 2 3/4 minutes remaining. The gentlelady from California.
Do you have additional speakers?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to inquire of my friend. I am prepared to close when she is done with the
I have one more speaker. Do you?
I am the last speaker.
Yes, I reclaiming my time. I'd like to say that I will take a moment, and then I'm turning over to close to Mr. Garamendi.
So, Mr. Chairman, the gentlelady counting herself has 2 speakers. Did I hear her correctly?
Correct.
I'll reserve.
Gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you have heard, and I also would like to introduce into the record a listing of all the groups that are opposed. In them is elected officials, newspapers, business, 10 civic groups, 18 water districts, local government, 103 environmental, and the list just goes on for the record.
The gentlelady's request will be considered in general leave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask my colleagues on both sides to consider what this bill will do. And I now yield the time to Mr. Garamendi for closing.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If you know California water, you know that we can get pretty wound up about it. And the solution for California water is not to be found in this particular piece of legislation. Facts are difficult things to deal with, but they are facts. There's been no man-made drought. There was a very real drought, and in addition to that, there were restrictions on the pumping. Let us understand that the principal advocates of this bill have the shortest straw. They came last in line, and therefore they're not first. They're last, and their contract provided for shortage provisions for a variety of reasons, among them droughts and environmental restrictions. So they should have planned for that. Apparently they did not. The losses to the agricultural community were significant, to be sure, but at the same time, the agricultural community in the Central Valley prospered, having the best years to any previous year that occurred during this drought period. Certain farmers were shorted, no doubt about that, but they had a contract that called for those shortages. Now let us understand that this bill has profound implications on every state, some 21 states, that have contracts with the Bureau of Reclamation. This bill, should it pass and become law, is a signal to every state that you cannot count on state law allocating the water within your district. Instead, it will be Congress that will allocate the water within your state. That is a profound change. 100 years of reclamation law are pushed aside by this piece of legislation. And for the state of California, it is a total preemption of state law, a total preemption of state law. And state constitution is pushed aside. There is within the California Constitution a thing called the public trust. The legislature and the government of California holds in trust for the people of California the water of California. And this legislation pushes that aside and gives that water to a very special group.
Time of the gentleman from California has expired. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, am I correct to assume that all their time has expired?
All time has expired for the gentlelady from California.
In that case, Mr. Chairman, I will yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman's recognized.
There's been much discussion on the floor about preemption. In fact, the previous speaker emphasized that in his close. I'm from a western state. I'm from Washington. If anybody should be cautious about preemption, it is certainly me. And I say that because I represent an area that has 2 over half a million acre irrigation districts. So I understand about preemption and Western water law. But in the context of today's debate, the California water system is very unique. Here we have a massive federal system, the Central Valley Project, and a massive state water project called the State Water Project. And it operates as one combined unit. And this is what is very important, Mr. Chairman. The coordinated approach was requested by the state and codified by the federal government in 1986. That's when water law was preempted. They asked for it in 1986. In 1992, it was further preempted by amendments to the law in the Central Valley Project in 1992. So what we did in committee is that we offered an amendment that was adopted. And let me read the amendments by Mr. Tipton and Mr. Gosar. And it says, and I quote, Congress finds and declares that 1, coordinated operations between the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project previously requested, like I said, and consented to by the State of California and the federal government require assertion of federal supremacy to existing water rights throughout the system. That's in California. And 2, these circumstances are unique to California, therefore nothing in this act shall serve as a precedent to any other state, end quote. When we offered that amendment, everybody on our side of the aisle voted for it. Only 4 on their side of the aisle, when they had an opportunity to make sure preemption wouldn't happen, they voted no. You can't have it both ways, Mr. Chairman. So with that, I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered read for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Natural Resources printed in the bill, it shall be in order to consider as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of the Rules Committee print 112-15. That amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read. No amendment to that amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in House Report 112-405. Each such amendment may be offered only in order printed in the report by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider amendment number 1, printed in House Rule 112-405. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment made in order under the rule.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in House Report number 112-405, offered by Mr. McClintock of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 566, the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment addresses 2 concerns that have been raised by opponents of the bill during the committee markup and here on the floor today. A great deal of time during that markup, and more today, was spent addressing concerns that the bill provides for 40-year contracts that can be renewed each year. The minority charged that this amounts to de facto privatization of a public resource. Well, we have tried over and over to explain to them that 40-year successive renewal contracts are the rule in Western water law, and the 25-year provision for the Central Valley Project was actually the exception. Indeed, the CVP used to operate with a 40-year provision until that was changed in 1992. This amendment makes it absolutely crystal clear, I certainly hope, that the contract provisions for the Central Valley Project must be in conformity with the Act of July 2, 1956, that amended the Reclamation Projects Act of 1939. These provisions govern all reclamation projects throughout the western United States and treats the CVP contracts no differently. I hope that this provision settles this issue. The second substantive provision, also included to deference to opponents of the measures, arises from an amendment that attempts to expedite 4 Cal-Fed surface water projects. It was charged that the wording would have interfered with authorization of the project. This amendment makes it crystal clear that these 4 projects are authorized as long as non-federal financing is used. This clears the way for local, state, and private funds to be applied immediately to the construction of these facilities. The rest of the amendments are technical. They remove superfluous language, correct misspellings, and correct an inadvertent omission. And with that, I'd reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves his time. Who seeks recognition in opposition to the amendment? Gentlelady from California.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, I wish to speak on this issue.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as my colleague has said, his amendment makes technical changes to the legislation, but it leaves in question and very much in doubt although it says 40-year rule in the Western Water is standard, but is this in perpetuity? And I would like a response on that, if I may involve myself in a colloquy with my colleague, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlelady from California.
I asked for, if I may, ask a response from my colleague in colloquy to a question. He's made a statement, and I'd like a clarification.
The lady may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is this a renewal for every 40 years, or is it in perpetuity?
Let me read directly from the Act of July 2nd, 1956, governing all reclamation contracts, including those under this legislation. The Secretary of the Interior shall include in any long-term
reclaiming
contract...
my time, Mr. Speaker, I don't wish to know of 56. I wish to know what your amendment does.
This amendment applies the act that I was just reading to the Central Valley project. I'm specifically answering the gentlelady's question by quoting directly from the text of the act that this proposes.
I would ask again, is it in perpetuity?
No, it has to be negotiated, and if I could just read the text, I think this will answer the question.
Thank you, Mr. Gentleman. I am claiming my time.
The gentlelady from California controls the time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you to my colleague. The technical amendment also makes substantive corrections into the language passed out in committee. And while we were not consulted in the drafting of this amendment, we don't oppose the amendment as it does nothing substantial, and I yield back my time.
The lady yields back her time. The gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could now answer the question of the gentlelady that she didn't seem to want to hear, it is this. This Act applies, the Act of July 2nd, 1956, to all contracts in the CVP under this legislation. That legislation states, the Secretary of the Interior shall include in any long-term contract hereafter entered into, if the other contracting party so requests, for renewal thereof under stated terms and conditions mutually agreeable to the parties. And I repeat, under stated terms and conditions mutually agreeable to the parties, unquote. This is not automatic renewal. This is negotiated anew between the government and the contractor. The only exception to that act under this bill is to accommodate the early repayment of federal loans, which would be a boon to the cash-strapped federal treasury. Mr. Chairman, as we have repeatedly tried to explain to the minority, this measure simply applies the same standards to the CVP as are applied to all other water contracts throughout the western United States. It was a punitive act by this Congress in 1992 that reduced the amount of time in these contracts from 40 years to 25 years exclusively for the CVP. This legislation sets that right and returns the CVP to equal treatment with any other water project in the western United States. And I'll reserve the balance of my time unless the gentlelady is closed.
The gentlelady from California, Chair wishes to clarify, is not in opposition to the amendment, but has yielded back the remainder of her time.
To reclaim my time, Mr. Speaker.
Objection to the unanimous consent request to reclaim her time. Seeing none, the gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I just want to thank my colleague on the other side for clarifying that, and I'd like to yield any additional time to Mr. Garamendi.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
There's always the rest of the story. And while this amendment deals with one of the pernicious parts of the legislation that would have been a perpetual contract, it does not deal with the remaining pieces of the Central Valley Improvement Act, which dealt with the issue of how those contracts were to be renegotiated at the end of 40 years. In fact, those parts of the Central Valley Improvement Act that said in the renegotiation process the federal government needed to take into account the issues of water availability. You know, maybe there's not that much water available and we need to downgrade, or maybe we need to increase the amount of water, take into account the environmental issues. So those very, very important qualifications on how the contracts would be renegotiated disappeared in the underlying bill. you did deal with one of the problems, and that is the perpetuity issue. And we understand that, but nonetheless, there's a very, very serious problem that remains in the negotiation or the renegotiation of the contracts, and therefore the amendment, while dealing with one problem, allows the remaining problems to exist. And those remaining problems are how and under what circumstances is the federal government to carry out the negotiations. That is, do we take into account environmental issues, fish in the river or not, availability of water or not? I think I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
To answer the gentleman very specifically, the contract negotiations are conducted in precisely the same manner as every other contract in the western United States. I would remind the gentleman and the gentlelady who carried the legislation, this Congress approved a 50-year contract for Hoover power users, and I would remind my friend the gentleman from California that during the markup he specifically said that he could probably live with 40 years. I hope that is still the case. I hope that these amendments assuage his concerns, and with that I yield back my time.
Would yield, I'd be happy to answer my...
California has yielded back his time. All time has expired. The question is on adoption of the amendment. All those in favor signify so by saying aye. Those opposed? In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report 112-405. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report Number 112-405, offered by Mr. Thompson of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 566, the gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
The Thompson-Eshoo Amendment states that nothing in this bill can go into effect if the Secretary of Interior determines that any agricultural, fishery, or related jobs will be lost in Northern California counties as a result of this bill. I represent a community with varied economic interests: agriculture, fisheries, and tourism. Our amendment would protect these jobs from this politically driven legislation that would divert water to south of Delta private agricultural interests. Proponents of this bill claim that the bill protects jobs. The bill does the exact opposite of what it claims to do. It's a job killer bill. It creates economic winners and losers based on south of Delta interests. The livelihoods and concerns of individuals outside of this limited area are ignored in order to support well-heeled agricultural interests south of the Delta. In my home district, over 2 million acres of farmland support a greater than $1 billion market value of products. Over 10% of these farms depend on irrigation. I do not believe that these farmers are less important than the south of Delta farmers. Their jobs, their income, their families should not be sacrificed. However, this is not simply a northern farmer versus southern farmer issue. Fishermen on the north coast of California saw the result of politically driven water resources decisions in 08 and 09, and they paid the price in almost 5,000 jobs and the economic loss of over $534 million. The Thompson-Eshoo Amendment would prevent any provisions of this bill from going into effect. It would result in the loss of jobs in Northern California. Join me in protecting jobs from this politically driven bill that prioritizes the agricultural economies south of the Delta over all others. And I would now yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague, Congresswoman Eshoo.
I thank the gentleman, and I
recognized for 2
thank
minutes.
you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the gentleman, and I rise in support of the amendment. Why? Because it states if any fishery-related or agricultural job is lost as a result of this act, the bill will not be enacted. And I think that that really sets down where we are. We need jobs in this country and not job-killing legislation. Now, this legislation would undo years of negotiations reached by the state of California, local ranchers, farmers, and other users of water from the San Joaquin River. It would set up a new round of water wars, which means more employment for lawyers, but not much for anybody else. My congressional district, which includes Silicon Valley and the fishing community of Half Moon Bay is not in the Delta. But my constituents oppose this legislation because their communities, their livelihoods, their resources will also be negatively affected by this bill. Now listen to what the Silicon Valley Leadership Group says. Over 350 major companies in Silicon Valley. We believe that H.R. 1837 would be counterproductive to the development of a comprehensive solution to the Golden State's waters programs, as it overrides many existing regulations and laws concerning the Delta ecosystem and undermines years of collaboration and goodwill developed by a broad coalition of actors and experts. And this mention of broad coalition, it's why this bill stinks, in plain English, because there's not a coalition. You have to build from the ground up with the stakeholders. That's why there's such a problem with it. Listen to what the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations says. It's the largest commercial fishermen's organization along the Pacific Coast. Make no mistake, this bill will only preempt state law. It will destroy jobs. One of the West Coast's oldest industries, our salmon fishery, along with the fishing community and the economy and heritage it represents.
Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to seek time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Denham.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Amazing the inconsistencies in the amendment itself. Here, the gentlelady is talking about San Jose, yet San Jose is south of the area that we're talking about, and yet the Silicon Valley receives water exports from the Delta. But let's take a different inconsistency. I represent Stanislaus County, which is north of Stockton. Maybe we need to look at a map. We actually have Stanislaus County that reaches up past the Delta, or past Stockton, San Joaquin County, Sacramento area, and yet we're going to be excluded. So it's one thing to pick winners and losers in this, but what we try to do is not pit north versus south, but we're trying to use natural resources in the best option available. I find it interesting, another inconsistency, this amendment, does it include forestry, which resides under the jurisdiction of USDA? Are the authors not concerned about the devastating effects of the timber industry and how it's suffered due to the ESA issues associated with the spotted owl? Many inconsistencies here. Pick your battle. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California has 1 minute remaining.
Reserve the balance of my time.
He reserves his time. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I please yield 2 minutes to the author of the legislation, Mr. Nunez.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. The gentleman from California, Mr. Denham, just made a very important point. Silicon Valley gets their water from Hetch Hetchy. San Francisco gets their water from Hetch Hetchy. What's Hetch Hetchy? Hetch Hetchy was dammed up. It's in Yosemite. And they pipe their water. So if they care about the fish and the fishermen, tear down the dam. Send their water out to the Delta. But they don't want to do that. Now, I have a lot of respect for my friend from Northern California, Mr. Thompson. We work together on many issues. But I have to remind the gentleman that the salmon fishermen were bailed out. They were given $230 million in payments. I think there needs to be a GAO study on where this money went to. Because we don't know where this money went. There's never been any report to show where this money went, $230 million. But it was the federal government that told the fishermen not to fish. And I would hope that the gentleman actually support this legislation, because what we have here is the fish that are killing the salmon are the bass. The bass fish do that. So let's let the fishermen go fish, and here's the gruesome picture again. I know you don't like to see it. Let's go get the bass that are eating the smelt, that then the salmon don't have anything to eat. The bass is a non-native species. So this bill allows fishermen to go back to work. And I would hope that the gentleman would support this bill, because we need to get the fishermen back to work. I agree. We don't want any more. We don't want to spend $230 million after the federal government tells the fishermen, no, you can't fish, and then pays them not to fish. That is insanity. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California.
I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I understand I have the right to close, and I only have one speaker, so I'll reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a couple of comments on some of the previous speakers' remarks. I'm glad to add forestry in one of the areas if there's any jobs lost that the bill won't go into effect, if that would garner my friend's support of this amendment. And as he mentioned, he said it himself, it creates winners and losers. That's not what we're about. We're about creating jobs, not moving jobs from one area to another. And my friend from California mentioned that there was no salmon fishing and it caused these problems. Well, there was no salmon fishing because the last politically motivated water policy killed 80,000 spawning salmon. It shut down the season. It shut it down. It cost people their boats. It cost people their jobs, motels, gas stations, bait shops, grocery stores. Everybody was hurt tremendously by that motion and by that matter, and now we're back at it again, trying once again to politically move water from one portion of the state to another. It's a job killer. It preempts state law. It's a bad bill, and it ought to be killed, and this amendment ought to be added to it.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield the balance of the time to the member of the committee and somebody who's worked on this legislation, Mr. McClintock.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment would allow the Interior Secretary to suspend this bill if he finds that one job is lost north of the Delta. Well, this is the same Interior Secretary who appeared before the Natural Resources Committee in 2009. At the time, thousands of farm workers were thrown into unemployment by the water diversions. Hundreds of thousands of acres of productive farmland were turned into a dust bowl. And amidst the crisis, he admitted that as Interior Secretary, he had the authority to stop the diversions and end the agony of the Central Valley, but he chose not to do so because, in his words, quote, it would be like admitting defeat. And this is the man that the gentleman from California would give the power, upon finding a single lost job in Northern California, to plunge our state into another government-created dust bowl? I don't think so. No, I will not. The Northern California Water Association represents the farms and communities of Northern California, and they write of this bill, quote, the bill, if enacted, would provide an unprecedented federal statutory express recognition of and commitment to California's state water rights priority system and area of origin protections. This is important for the region to provide sustainable water supplies for productive farmlands, wildlife refuges, and managed wetlands, cities and rural communities, recreation and meandering rivers that support important fisheries, unquote. So speaks Northern California.
Would the gentleman yield on that point?
No. Mr. Chairman, fewer Americans are working today than on the day that this administration took office. We will not put in the hands of that administration the power to destroy still more jobs, which this amendment cynically seeks to do.
Time of the gentleman from California has expired. Time of the gentleman from Washington has expired. All time having expired. The question is on adoption of the amendment. All those in favor signify so by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The
Speaker, I'd like a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18 for the proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson, will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report Number 112405. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report Number 112-405, offered by Mr. McNerney of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 566, the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to represent much of the San Joaquin Delta, and the Delta is a precious resource that provides water for urban, industrial, and agricultural uses throughout the state of California. The Delta flows through 5 northern California counties that are home to 4 million people. The Delta is a region to big cities,
small towns, and lush farmlands. Just like other Californians, the people of the Delta deserve access to clean, safe drinking water. I'm deeply concerned that, as currently written, H.R. 1837 will severely erode the quality of our local water resources. This issue is important to public health and to local governments throughout Northern California. This bill takes more of our fresh water, and what's left will be saltier and lower quality. The deterioration of the Delta water increases treatment costs by tens of millions of dollars and requires hundreds of millions of dollars in new capital investments. This bill will hurt the people. Unfortunately, many communities in the Delta are struggling with budget and public health challenges as it is. The last thing we need is for the Congress to pass a bill that threatens our well-being and forces us to spend millions more to just treat our water. It's bad enough to steal somebody's water. It's even worse to steal their water and then charge them millions of dollars for the privilege. This legislation we are considering today should not pass. It will harm the safety of drinking water supplies of the Delta communities. My amendment makes sure that before this bill comes into effect, it won't burden the Delta with heavy costs and new public health threats. I ask all of my colleagues to support my amendment, which will secure the safety and security of our drinking water, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington rise?
Mr. Chairman, I claim the time in opposition, and I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Nunez.
Mr. Nunez recognized for 4 minutes.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, once again, I don't believe the other side has read the bill. This bill provides for the ultimate protections for Delta communities. Ultimate protections that guarantees their God-given right to their property and to their water. That's what this bill does. So if you vote against this bill, you're voting to continue the attack on farmers all over the state and communities all over the state. So if Delta farmers want to continue to take water out of the Delta like they've been doing for 100 years, have always had their allocation, this bill guarantees that. Now, I've been to the Delta numerous times, and I've spoke to the communities there. Their number one concern is that they do not want the peripheral canal to be built. Well, if you vote against this bill, you are voting to ensure that Jerry Brown, the governor of California who opposes this bill, gets his wish to build the peripheral canal that the Delta farmers don't want. So if the gentleman wants the peripheral canal built, vote against the bill. If the gentleman wants to make sure that his farmers are not guaranteed the right for water, vote against the bill. But I find it ironic that the minority is arguing for the Delta farmers and the Delta communities, but at the very basic level, the people who are behind this, the governor of California was just here the other day advocating to build the peripheral canal that the gentleman says that his constituents don't want. Well, my constituents don't want it either. Neither do the people in the north. None of us want to build a multi-billion-dollar project like this. And we don't have to, because passage of this bill allows valuable water to be moved across the Delta in a more equitable fashion to guarantee waterfowl and fish populations that would increase, and guarantees rights to farmers and farm workers and communities. That's what this bill does. So I would hope that folks in this body and the gentleman himself would maybe withdraw his amendment, and so that we don't have to take a vote on this gentleman to vote on an amendment that would basically ensure that he would be supporting Jerry Brown and the Democratic administration that want to take his water away from him that he so cherishes. So Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, I will just say that we need to slow down. I would hope that the other side would take a look at this bill, read the bill, because once they find out, they will figure out that all the stakeholders were together. All the stakeholders were together in 1994 when everyone sat down to make this agreement. And that's what this goes back to. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman reserve. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly appreciate the passion of my colleague from California. But if this bill is beneficial to the Delta, then why does every Delta county oppose the bill? They made it very clear to me they're concerned. And to protect the drinking water, the quality of the drinking water, is something that everyone can understand. What it seems to me is happening is that the other side is saying, we have the money, we have the votes, let's go get the water. This is might makes right. And we know in this country that might doesn't make right. We have laws that have been observed. We're working through processes now to shortcut that process right now and start shipping all this water. Will devastate our community, and we're going to do everything we can to prevent it. And I want to recognize my colleague from New York, from California. Sorry about that, John. For 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Sometimes on this floor you just shake your head and wonder if you may have fallen down the rabbit hole and Alice in Wonderland is really real, where up is down and down is up and left is right and right is left and there's confusion abounding. I just heard the most amazing argument I could possibly have imagined, that somehow this bill will stop the peripheral canal. I think not. Except, well, perhaps it will, because it will totally destroy any opportunity that there may be for California to come together around a comprehensive solution to its water situation. It just makes me wonder what in the world is going on here. Particularly, my colleague from California that wants to represent this county of Tuolumne may want to read his own bill, where he wipes out all of the contracting provisions in the Central Valley Improvement Act, in which Tuolumne County Regional Water Agency is given the right to water out of the Manu Maloney's Reservoir. That's gone. And oh, by the way, if you happen to care about veterans who might somehow be placed in the San Joaquin Valley National Cemetery, their 850 acre-feet of water is also wiped out. This bill has far-reaching effects. It has far-reaching effects. In wiping out the Central Valley Improvement Act, it also wipes out the environmental laws, wipes out the water for the Central Valley National Cemetery, wipes out the water for Tuolumne County, and what effect it has on the peripheral canal, I just can't understand, other than it will destroy whatever comity and working together there is in California to solve the overarching problems. And by the way, you are stealing 800,000 acre-feet of water from the Delta. You are stealing 800,000 acre-feet of water from the Delta in this bill. That's water that the Delta community needs. That's water that the Delta community needs for its citizens, for water quality, and for agriculture.
What purpose does the gentleman from Washington rise?
Mr. Chairman, how much time on both sides?
The gentleman from Washington has 2 minutes remaining. The gentleman from California's time has expired.
His time has expired. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of the time to the gentleman from California, Mr. Nunez.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this debate is really incredible. There's nothing about veteran cemeteries in this bill. Now, I can understand why the minority would want to talk about veterans, because we love our veterans in this country and we do everything to support them. But it is a stretch to say that a bill dealing with property rights somehow involves veteran cemeteries. But I will say, since we're talking about veterans, when we send our veterans overseas, or our men and women in the military, to protect this country, we have a right to protect people's private property. And that's what this bill does. Now, I know my other friends on the other side of the aisle who have continued to make this argument. They suddenly care about state preemption. Well, they didn't care about state preemption in 1986, 1992, when they sat down in 1994, when they did their boondoggle in 2009. They didn't care about state preemption now. But boy, today, when we talk about guaranteeing people their right to their private property, they suddenly are the defenders of the Constitution. I mean, this is really stretching it. And I know that the gentleman who was the undersecretary at the time, who made the deal in 1994 that was bragged about by not only the former chairman of the Resources Committee at the time, bragged about the Bay Delta Accord of 1994, not only the undersecretary of the Interior and the Secretary of Interior himself and President Bill Clinton, they all supported the 94 agreement. So all this talk about comprehensive reform and getting people to the table, we've done that before, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, what that results in is the illegal taking of people's personal property.
Much time has expired. All time having expired, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no.